Okay. At the beginning of Seeing Like a State, James Scott writes that the pre-modern state was, in many crucial respects, partially blind. It knew precious little about its subjects, their wealth, their land holdings and yields, their location, their very identity. It was, Scott argues, population registries, which, in conjunction with the introduction of surnames and the development of means of pinpointing the location of these persons, first made it possible for state officials to dream of a perfectly legible population. The collection of personal information is the sine qua non of diverse political rationalities: sovereign control of territory, the disciplinary fixing of individuals in social and geographical space, and the biopolitical cultivation of populations. However, the extent to which such information can be used for any of these purposes depends on the ability to collect this information, channel it to the center of the organization where it can be integrated with other information and analyzed, and then return it to the bureaucratic periphery, which is the site of encounter between the state administration and the individual citizen. However, in their original form, population registries were simply represented snapshots produced by one-time or periodic censuses conducted for circumscribed purposes, and they were not capable of producing the continuous, individualized information required by the modern state in order to make good on its claims to sovereignty and to fulfill its obligation to promote the welfare and security of its people. What good, for example, does it do to have a registry listing the individual members of a population if the list cannot be kept up to date, if the state cannot continuously keep track of the mobile individual and make him or her into the object of administrative solicitude and control, which was just described for us? If it cannot be assured that every individual is included in the registry, that every individual is counted only once, and that the proper distinctions are made both among citizens and between citizens and others. If it cannot be assured that all of the information needed for diverse administrative purposes is collected and made available to the relevant agencies in a complete and timely manner and in actionable form. And if it cannot be assured that every individual is uniquely identified and that personal information is attached to the proper biological individual. Solving these problems where surveillance and information processing were two sides of the same coin, was crucial to the development of the modern state. In his book, John Agar said that it was important to bring the bureau back into bureaucracy, but I also want to emphasize that it's important to think about how bureaucracy generates kratos, generates power in the history of modern state making. My main claim is that across the mid-20th century, the German state was engaged in a vast legibility project to map its interior terrain and the lives of its population. The core administrative mechanism on which this project depended was a comprehensive, increasingly integrated, and ultimately computerized population information, identification, and control system. The system was comprised of a number of distinct technologies, and its functioning depended on both the bureaucratic procedures that controlled the flow of personal information within the public sector and the new information and communication technologies through which these different sources of information were linked with one another. However, these developments were not uncontested, and I argue that the consolidation of this system gave rise to new discourses on privacy, which became the primary means of theorizing the expanding capacity of the state to collect, process, and make use of personal information on its citizens. The most influential study of population registration in modern Germany portrays the registries as instruments of racial discrimination, disciplining, and exclusion. However, although many of the key innovations in the history of population registration and identification in Germany may have been made by the Nazis, I argue that Nazi-era reforms of population registration and identification look very different when they are embedded in a longer history of state-making than they do when we follow Ali and Lot in viewing them primarily as instruments of the Holocaust. I don't have the time to show how the existing bureaucratic infrastructure and available information technologies limited the scope and intensity of population surveillance before 1945. There are, however, two problem complexes that at least need to be mentioned in order to understand the later fascination with integrated information systems. The first relates to the use of population registration to track the movement of individuals across time and space. The holy grail here was a system of universal backwards reporting, or Rückmeldung, which would have required registry officials in a person's place of residence to inform their counterparts in the person's previous residence where the person had actually settled, and which would have given the officials in this previous residence the opportunity to let their counterparts know whether the person had a criminal or political past that would merit closer surveillance. While Prussia had repeatedly rejected the idea of a comprehensive backwards reporting system for the entire population, the Nazis regarded this as a key to mobilizing the nation for war. And the creation of a unitary state and a national police force in the late 1930s first established the bureaucratic infrastructure for such a system. On the other hand, it's interesting to note that the Nazis rejected the idea of a single centralized national population registry because they felt that a rigorously enforced decentralized system was equally effective but far more efficient. The second issue relates to the problem of data integration. The population registries were not the only source of population information. Local government also maintained registries of personal information for a variety of purposes. The tax offices maintained separate lists for the collection of every kind of tax. And in the 1930s, these problems were further complicated by the reintroduction of universal mail conscription and the establishment of the Volkskartei, or National Registry, which was designed to collect information that the population registries were structurally incapable of providing. The collection of the same basic identifying information for all of these separate registries entailed a great amount of redundant labor. However, in the age of paper, any attempt to consolidate these diverse bodies of personal information led to bureaucratic turf wars, and the potential savings from such integration were more than offset by the increasing complexity of the forms that would have to be used to collect and store this information. In other words, in the pre-computer era, separate registries, separate censuses dedicated to collecting the information needed for specific purposes seemed to be the best way to meet the informational needs of the state. Though it also needs to be noted that, especially during the Third Reich, the constant exchange of information among these different registries enabled each of them to serve as a check on the other while entangling the population in an increasingly dense surveillance network. Skipping now ahead into the 1960s, 1970s, planning was the master concept in the political discourse of the Federal Republic during this period. However, there was a second concept closely related to planning that has received much less scholarly attention, and that, of course, is information. Information was the stuff, the raw material with which planners worked. The population registries, along with the census and the microcensus, were the most important sources of such information in West Germany. And the proposed federal population registration law was the most important attempt to modernize and expand the collection of population information by the state during this decade or so. Although government agencies at every level held vast quantities of information on individual citizens, these card files and paper dossiers were organized to meet the administrative, regulatory, and revenue-generating needs of the agency that produced them. Information pertaining to a specific individual could not easily be linked across these agencies, And as a result, each agency created more work for itself and for the public by collecting and maintaining all the information it needed to carry out its mission. Integrated information systems promised to bring about a revolution in administrative practice. By linking across functional domains, the discrete pieces of information pertaining to specific individuals, such systems promise to eliminate redundancies, increase efficiency, generate new insights and new information, and thereby transform information processing from a bureaucratic burden into a political resource. The Interior Ministry hoped that the proposed national ID number, the Personenkennzeichen, whose introduction was one of the central goals of the population registration law that was introduced in April 1968, would serve as the cornerstone for an integrated population information system that would transform the registries into the informational foundation for the civilian administration and for social planning. The basic principle, as we all know, of such integrated information systems was that all of the administratively relevant information pertaining to a specific individual should be collected once and only once, and then stored in a single location, where it could then be made available in up-to-date form on an as-needed basis to all other users who would thus be in a position to make use of this information and update it. The local population registries were chosen as the central node in this information system because they held 90% of the personal information needed by the administration. This federal population information law was explicitly conceived as an information law. From the early modern period into the 20th century, the population registries had been intended primarily to facilitate the work of the police. However, the architects of the law saw themselves as continuing a transformation which had begun at the turn of the century and had then been partially codified in 1938 by the Reichsmeldeordnung I lost my track here, of continuing the transformation of the registries into a multifunctional source of information for the civilian administration. And they argued that these administrative and social functions had assumed such a prominent role that it was that they had overshadowed the police role, that it was necessary to give them a legal foundation. And this was the basis, this was the thrust of the population registration law. This system would have enhanced the surveillance capacity of the state in several respects. And I'm going to have to skip over the details here in order to save time, though I do have to point out that the system, had it been constructed, would have reinstituted in electronic form the universal backward reporting system that had been created by the Nazis, but that had collapsed at the end of World War II. The kind of population information system that national officials envisioned was realized to a large degree by the state-level population information system rolled out by Rheinland-Pfalz in 1971. At this time, this was the most complex such information system in the Federal Republic, and it was, as you can see here, it was the first to make widespread use of telematics to connect police and population registration offices in the state's largest cities. The scope of the information collected in this system was so comprehensive and detailed because it was designed to include all of the information needed by local government, needed by local administration for every role or capacity in which the individual citizen could conceivably interact with it. However, Rheinland-Pfalz was precocious, and the nationwide automation of the population registries stretched out across the entire 1970s. Although integrated information systems promised many benefits, they were also the source of new problems. First, planning and decision-making depended on access to the relevant information, and there was a widely shared sense that complex organizations, both public and private, would have to be reorganized to align decision-making authority more closely with the actual flows of information. Second, Integrated information systems and online connections made it possible for the first time to regard the entire public administration, however we may define this thing, as a single unified informational entity. However, many people worried that these developments were leading to a dangerous concentration of power and thereby eroding the limits on executive authority that were grounded in administrative practices associated with older information technologies. In other words, with paper. While information had, in the age of paper, only been made available to other agencies on the basis of a case-by-case evaluation of the needs of the office requesting the data, integrated information systems and online connections threaten to eliminate these technological and organizational checks on state power. Third, the most elemental function of integrated information systems was to abstract information from its original context and purpose and bring it into relation with other similarly abstracted pieces of information to create an entirely new representation of the data subject. While highly formalized schemata were essential to ensuring that information flowed quickly through any bureaucracy, this reduction of context tended to alienate the individual from his information. And privacy advocates argued that, when carried to its logical extreme, the individual would find his real identity and history had been virtually supplanted by such data doubles. And I argue that these early 1970s reflections on the functioning of such systems antedated arguments by Gilles Deleuze, Jean Baudrillard, Marc Poster, and the Surveillance Studies Group. Relatively little is known about West German attitudes towards computers and their discursive positioning in Cold War Europe in the 1950s and 60s. However, it's important to avoid painting these attitudes in excessively dark colors in order to establish the prescience of later critics. Many people were fascinated by the capacity of these machines. We can see an attitude that's mocked in this picture, which appeared in both Die Zeit and Der Spiegel. And, as we can see in this picture, which graced the cover of an informational booklet put out by the Interior Ministry to gain popular support for the population registration law, both the officials who drafted the law and the computer companies behind it were confident that more information and better technologies for collecting and analyzing it would lead to better government, more modern government, more rational government. The problem was that the linkage between planning, information technology, emancipation, and modernity was such a compelling linkage that, at least initially, privacy was hardly conceived as a problem. The draft federal population registration law did not systematically address the privacy question. It simply stated that the collection, administration, and exchange of personal information was not to infringe on the legitimate privacy concerns of the individual. However, in the spring of 1969, the Bundestag passed a resolution asking the administration to ensure that the use of the new information technologies by the population registration system would not encroach upon the private sphere. This was the origin of what would become the Federal Privacy Protection Law. And from this point onward, population registration and privacy protection were joined at the hip. Initially, there was substantial support for the ID number. However, as people gained a deeper understanding of how the proposed population information system was supposed to work, this legislative and popular support began to erode. There were numerous changes, tinkering with the law across the early 1970s. The most important development did not come until May 1976. And at this point, the Bundestag Legal Affairs Committee unexpectedly came out against the law that it had been working on for 6 years, arguing that the data linkages made possible by the national ID number represented an unconstitutional violation of personal privacy. What sense did it make, the committee asked, to approve a privacy protection law if its stated goals were going to be undermined by the introduction of a national ID number? This decision was a political disaster for the administration, but the administration had too much invested in the undertaking to let it drop. The terrorist attacks of 1977 gave new life to the idea of the registry. The administration proposed a new version without the ID number, but still keeping the registration system as the basis of a national information system, while doing all sorts of things behind the scenes to make it of greater value to the police. This led to an uproar, and the law had to be pulled. In 1978, in January 1978, the federal privacy protection law went into effect. The new Interior Minister, Gerhard Baum, was more sensitive to privacy concerns than his predecessor, and the revised population registration framework law, which was submitted to the Bundestag in March 1980, differed in fundamental respects from previous versions. The new law no longer sought to make the registries into the foundation for a national population information system. Instead, it only charged the population registries with the much more limited responsibility of collecting the information specifically required, as specifically needed to determine the identity and locality of the nation's residents. The law also allowed the states to have the registries to collect more information, but then it insisted that the registries could only use this information for these other ancillary purposes, not for general administrative and planning purposes. This compartmentalization was the antithesis of the integrated information processing and social planning system that had inspired the original version of the law in 1968. These provisions made the law, which was approved by the Bundestag in 1980, made both this law and the new amendment to the Social Insurance Code into the first domain-specific privacy laws, which applied the general principles of the federal privacy protection law to the concrete problems raised by the use of personal information in specific areas of the public administration. Now, I'd like to make 3 brief points in conclusion. 1 paragraph. Okay, first, since the turn of the century, population registration, administrative procedures, and information technologies had evolved in tandem with one another. And one of the reasons why everybody was so fascinated with the original population registration law is that it promised to solve all of the problems that I described at the beginning relating to the age of paper. Second, the new information technologies were, as we can see, caught up in the surveillance state debate in ways that I'm not even going to try to talk about here. And third, legislative intentions notwithstanding, the privacy implications of the population registration law were anything but clear, because there were political doors and technological workarounds to virtually every restraint that the legislators claimed to be putting on the use of population information. So ironically, and this is my big thesis in the book that I'm working on, is that the laws that were marketed, so to speak, as data protection laws, more often than not ended up being information access laws that legitimated most of the new kinds of population surveillance that had developed across the 1960s and 1970s. Thank you very much.